and then we get 5 to 10 minutes for Q&A, depending on how we're doing with time. Okay. No sé si... All right, 2 more minutes, and then we'll let people in and begin. Okay.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. I believe there's already 12 people within the session. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another activity of the 4th SAIL Academic Conference under the theme Language as a Means of Instruction. In a few minutes, we will begin. I ask that you keep your camera on and your microphone off. At the end of the presentation, we will give space for a Q&A session, depending on the time. But without further ado, I warmly welcome our speaker for this activity, Dr. Brian Tomlinson. Professor Tomlinson is considered one of the world's leading experts in the development of language learning materials. Throughout his life, he has worked as a teacher, teacher trainer, curriculum writer, and university lecturer in Japan, Indonesia, Nigeria, Singapore, the United Kingdom, Vanuatu, and Zambia. He is also the founder and president of the Materials Development Association, commonly known as MATSA, an international nonprofit organization that brings together researchers, editors, and teachers to collaborate in the development of quality materials for language learning. He has written and published numerous articles and books, including Material Development in Language Teaching. He was also the creator of the magazine Folio and has taught together with Hitomi Masura various workshops on material writing and in Botswana, Malaysia, Mauritius, Mexico, the Seychelles, Singapore, Turkey, and Vietnam. He has also organized and presented the opening plenary sessions for 30 international congresses of the MATSA. He is currently visiting professor at the University of Liverpool and a member of the British Council English Language Advisory Group. So go ahead, Dr. Tomlinson, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Greetings from Freshfield in England. This is a small village on the coast, small village with a big beach, and it's near the most friendly city in the world. I'll give you a guess as to the city. It's the most friendly city in the world. It's also got the best football team in the world, and it is, of course, Liverpool. So I live close to Liverpool. Liverpool is my favorite city and my favorite team, and today we won 1-0. And we're now top of the league, so I'm very happy. I noticed that Pachuca have a very good football team, and you're playing in the World Club Champions Tournament in the USA in December, where there's a very good chance you might play against Real Madrid. So I hope you beat Real Madrid, because I'm also a Barcelona supporter. Okay, so we've got something in common. I'm going to start by telling a story, which is a rather unusual way to start. I'll explain why in a minute. First of all, I'd like to apologize in case there are any Americans or Irishmen in the audience, because this is a story about an American and an Irishman. An American and an Irishman were flying across the Atlantic to Europe. It's a long flight. The Irishman was very tired and he wanted to go to sleep. But the American was wide awake and full of life. And he said to the Irishman, let's have a quiz. And the Irishman said, no, I want to go to sleep. No, listen, said the American. I ask you a question, and if you can't answer it, you give me $10. You ask me a question, and if I can't answer it, I'll give you $100. Okay, said the Irishman, let's play. So the American said to the Irishman, what's the distance between the Earth and the Moon? And the Irishman immediately put his hand in his pocket and gave the American $10. So the American said, okay, it's my turn. What goes up a hill with 3 legs and comes down with 2? What goes up a hill with 3 legs and comes down with 2? And the American thought about this and he couldn't find an answer. And the Irishman, after a while, went back to sleep. And the American was really disturbed because he just couldn't think of the answer. What goes up a hill with 3 legs and comes down with 2? He phoned a friend. He checked Wikipedia. He just couldn't find the answer. So eventually he woke up the Irishman and he gave the Irishman $100. And he said to the Irishman, well, come on then, you tell me, what does go up a hill with 3 legs and comes down with 2? And the Irishman put his hand in his pocket and gave the American $10. Okay, you got to think about that. Right, so what I've just done with you is something I do at the beginning of every lesson. I call it a task-free activity. If I can have the first slide, please. Okay, could I have the first slide? Yeah, okay. Right, so if you move on to the next one. Right, what I call a task-free activity. And this involves, at the beginning of every lesson, the learners listening to their teacher, telling a joke, telling a story, telling a personal anecdote, performing a poem or an extract from a play, or reading an extract from a newspaper. It's just a 5-minute activity, and it's teacher-led, it's teacher-centered. The students just listen, and there's no task, there are no questions. I haven't asked you any comprehension questions at all. So the teacher performs and then leaves a couple of minutes of silence, and then says to the students, if you move on to the next one. Oh, so, yeah, so it doesn't require the learners to answer any questions or do any tasks, okay? Leaves the learners in silence for a couple of minutes, okay? Right, and at the end of the 5 minutes, the teacher says, don't forget, at the end of the lesson, you can take a copy of the joke, the poem, the story, either in written form, print form, or digital. And what the learners do, they only take it if they've enjoyed it, if they've been motivated. They don't have to take it. It's going to be no test on it. And they put it into a file. So they build up over the year a very large collection of texts which have engaged them. So a very valuable source of input for language acquisition, motivated text. And what I have found is many of the students, just before the beginning of a lesson, will ask me questions about the text. I don't ask them any questions, they ask me, because they're curious, they want to know, they've enjoyed the text. And there's no mark for it, there's no assessment whatsoever. So it's a very positive way of starting a lesson. If you could just move on to the next one, please. All right, and the objectives of this are very simple. And again, yeah, and again. Right, so what you're doing is massively increasing the exposure to the L2 in use. And I'm arguing this is a prerequisite for language acquisition. You need massive exposure to the language in use, not in practice, not in examples, but in actual use. And ideally, this should be motivated, engaging. And if you go to the next one, all right, and I'm going to mention these words many times. It should achieve affective and cognitive engagement. By this, I mean affective engagement engages the emotions. So the students laugh or cry or are excited or worried or sympathetic. They're feeling, because that's how the brain learns. If the brain is engaged emotionally, the brain thinks this is significant and it learns. If there is no affective engagement, there is no learning. And this is the same with cognitive engagement. By this, I mean stimulating the learner to think not about the language, about the content. And if the learner is in deep thought about the content, there is a much greater chance of acquisition of the language. So I'm saying this is one very effective way of achieving this. Okay, and then the next one, number 3. To increase opportunities for recycling of comprehensible language. In the story I just told, I repeated the question form many times, naturally, not as practice, not as a drill, but as normal communication. Right? The learners have listened to it. They take it home, they read it again. They come and ask questions, and many times they will go back to it and read it. So maybe that joke I've just told, they haven't understood at first. So they read it, they ask their friend, then maybe 2 days later, they ask the teacher. So there's a lot of recycling of language. So I'm saying exposure, engagement, recycling are essential for language acquisition. Okay? And it starts the lesson in a positive way. Right? The teacher's not saying, read this passage and then answer the questions. Immediate stress for the students. There's no stress. My students from many years of teacher training courses have been doing this with their students all over the world. And they report a very positive feedback from students. One teacher of German as a foreign language did this. She read German poems and stories at the beginning of the lesson. At the end of the year, in their feedback questionnaire, the question, which activity did you enjoy most? Reading poems and stories at the beginning of the lesson. Which was the most useful for learning? Reading poems and stories at the beginning of the lesson. So it's such an easy thing to do, but it's so valuable. But you've got to try and find, you're looking for potentially engaging text. Something will make the students think, something which will make them laugh or cry or be excited, something which will engage them. And it's therefore a very valuable way of starting a lesson. Now, I do this with primary kids, secondary kids, adults, and I do it on English as a medium of instruction courses. It doesn't matter who the students are. You've got to find the text appropriate to the students, or you ask the students to find text themselves and bring them. So you form groups, and group 1, okay, bring me an engaging text for next week. And the students have to go out and look for texts which will engage their fellow learners. Okay, so that's why I told you the story, to emphasize something I really believe in. Right, let's switch now to the topic, which is learning content through an L2. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I'm sure you know all about this. There are many reasons for learning content through an L2. If the L2 is a world language shared by users with different L1s, then it opens up possibilities for international communication. And obviously, this is the case with English. English is obviously a world language. and it's used for international communication. And I can give you many examples. For example, in Southeast Asia, there's an organization called SEAMEO, SEAMEO. About 9 Southeast Asian countries have come together: Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam. And they have conferences and meetings and projects. And the language of these meetings is English. None of them speak English as a first language, but it's the language of their meetings. And very interestingly, in Thailand, most companies now conduct their business in English. Even if it's a Thai talking to a Thai, they talk in English. So this means that if you go on to the next one, very obvious point, leading from number 1 is number 2, which is learning content. So learning business through English provides the learners with career opportunities. In Thailand, you now will not get a job in a company unless you can communicate in English. So a very strange situation. In Chile, for example, they're planning to make hopefully everyone bilingual, Spanish and English. So they're attempting to make English a first language along with Spanish. So learning it through the L2 provides an opportunity to learn the content and develop communicative ability in the L2 at the same time. So it's a very economical way of learning history, politics, whatever, and at the same time, not learning about a language, but developing communicative ability in the language. And that's what matters. It's not knowledge of English that matters, it's ability to communicate in English. Okay, and if we go on to the next one, and ways of doing this, I'll skip over this fairly quickly. The conference is about EMI. EMI is normally defined like this: the use of English language to teach academic subjects other than English itself in countries where the first language of the majority of the population is not English. That's the standard definition of EMI. But I'm really interested in using it to teach skills or special interests. For example, football. A long time ago, I was director of a college in the UK for mature students of English as a foreign language. Every Tuesday and Thursday, instead of sitting in the classroom learning English, they learned English through pottery, sculpture, art, politics, architecture, or football. And I was the one who took them for football, and everything we did was in English. So we selected the teams in English, we decided on tactics in English, we played in English. If anyone spoke any language other than English during the game, it was a free kick. If you spoke French in the penalty area, it was a penalty. And then after the game, we analyzed the game. I did this also with a group of Indian students, and we filmed the game and then analyzed it afterwards in English. So all the kids who were doing this were really interested in football and very quickly developed the ability to talk about English through football. I've done it also with learning to play a musical instrument. Cooking was another of the subjects we had. So people actually brought ingredients and cooked meals in English. This is a form of EMI. Or special interest, for example, fashion, cinema. So it doesn't have to be an academic subject. And I have found it most useful, not with academic subjects, but with skills and special interests. So I would encourage, even if the students are learning English as a medium of instruction for an academic language, they're studying science, also include on their course English through skills, English through interests, because they are human beings who are scientists, but not just interested in science. I think this has been a big mistake with EAP and ESP to concentrate all the lessons on the subject. I remember at the same college, we had a group of airline pilots from Saudi Arabia. And one of them came to see me. I was director. And he complained. He said, "I'm sorry, Brian, we're enjoying the lessons, but we're getting fed up with talking about aircraft and flying. We do that all day in our jobs. We want to read some poems. We want to see some films." And I realized then we'd made a mistake in focusing too narrowly on the academic subject. And a group of scientists from China, very advanced post-PhD scientists, came to our college to prepare to go to the University of Cambridge to do post-PhD research. We prepared them in the language of their scientific subject. I went to Cambridge University to see how they were getting on. And I said, how are these guys getting on? Well, they're fantastic when we're discussing chemistry in the lab. But in the coffee bar and in the pub, they're hopeless. They just can't communicate. They don't seem to have the ability to communicate socially. And I realized again, we missed out something very, very important. And the scientists told me our major discoveries are through discussions in the pub or the coffee bar, not in the lab. Okay, so if you move on, please. Secondly, another way of doing this is what's called CLIL, an approach which is designed to help students learn content and then L2 at the same time. And it's very similar to EMI, but differs slightly. The learner's attention is deliberately focused on both content and language. Okay. There's a weak version, which I don't like, where the teacher will pre-teach and practice the language which is going to be used in the lesson. Personally, I think this is a waste of time. I much prefer the strong version, where you focus first on the content, not the language. And the language is taught what I call opportunistically and responsively. That is, you teach when it's needed. So if the students are having a discussion and there's a particular language problem, they might call over the teacher who responds to that opportunity. And that's why calling it opportunistically, it's an opportunity and the teacher responds to that opportunity to teach. Because I think this is a fact that learners do not learn what teachers teach. Teachers think they do and think they should do. There's no reason why if at the beginning of the lesson, the teacher says, today we're going to learn about the past perfect. And the question is why? Why should a learner learn about the past perfect? They don't need it. But if the learners are having a problem with the past perfect, then they need it. So I'm arguing for opportunistic and responsive teaching, not for an initial presentation. So this is my way of doing CLIL. Focus on the content, teach the language when it is needed, help the learners when it is needed. Okay, and thirdly, L2 support classes, which I've been doing for over 60 years. My very first job was in Nigeria in a teacher training college, and I taught English to trainee teachers. So this is the approach where you teach an academic subject in an L2, but the students also have additional L2 lessons where they focus on the language. They focus on the content in one lesson, on the language in the other. Now, ideally, the language learned in the support classes connects with the language used in the content lessons, but often it doesn't, because they're using one textbook for history and a different one for language, and there's no connection between them. So often the support classes are not supported. And I have taught support classes all over the world. If you go on to the next point, please. In Nigeria, Oman, Turkey, UK, Zambia. And I found often the students resented taking these classes. I remember especially in Japan, because they couldn't see the connection. They couldn't see how it helped them with the content subject. For this to be valuable, there's got to be a connection. The lessons have to be planned together, and very rarely does this happen. Okay, so those are the three approaches. What I'd like to focus on now is actual ways of teaching. I'll correct myself, not ways of teaching, ways of learning. We shouldn't be talking about teaching, we should be talking about learning. In my experience, there's too much teaching and not enough learning. I'll explain that as we go along. Okay, so we can move on. Right, so what are the prerequisites for successful learning through an L2 in any of these three approaches? Right, it's vital that teachers have sufficient subject expertise, but also have the communicative ability and confidence when using the L2. I taught first of all in Nigeria, and afterwards I moved to Zambia. In Zambia, they just achieved independence, and they massively expanded the number of schools. I think it went from 10 to 120 in 2 years. There were no teachers, there was a shortage of teachers. They brought teachers from Russia and France who couldn't speak English. And what happened was the Russian teacher that might be teaching physics, he would prepare his lesson in Russian and get someone to translate it, and then get a student to read it out. Waste of time, no engagement at all, no interaction at all. And it was the same with the French teachers. But I had a French teacher, a young French teacher, came to the school where I was working, and we took him to the bar, took him to the village bar, and gave him a few drinks and some courage. And the next day, he had to teach his first lesson in maths. Our group of friends, one of them was Irish, and he prefaced every sentence with, for fuck's sake, which is a common expression in Ireland. And this French teacher, Maurice, went into his class, maths class, first day, he said to the class, for fuck's sake. And that was the only English he knew. He picked up a lot of language in the bar. And when he went back to France, he became business manager of a French bank because of his English. But he was a great guy, a great teacher, but huge problem. Okay, so we go to the second one. So it's important that teacher has subject expertise and communicative ability. And that the materials used are suitable for L2 learners. I'm saying there that ideally you need recycling, you need local relevance, you need lots of examples and lots of illustrations. Too often the mistake made is to use a subject course book like science or technology from England or America, which has been written for native speakers. And often they don't have enough redundancy. It's too dense and too distant. A couple of examples here of how teachers have tried to overcome this. In China, where I was working, I went to observe a teacher, and what the teacher had done is to put the course book on the web and to change all the photographs and illustrations. So instead of a photo of somebody in New York, the photo was a teacher in the school or a student in the school. And instead of a building in Paris, the building was in Shanghai. So although he kept all the substance of the course book, all the texts and questions, all the illustrations were localized. And this had a great impact on the students. It brought them much closer to the textbook and much closer to the language. In Vietnam, a PhD student who I examined had done a similar thing with the course book. This was an American course book, and all the units were focused on American culture. So the unit on food was all about American food. And the students didn't like American food, didn't know anything about it, felt as though it was very distant and alien. So he kept the texts and exercises, but changed the food to Vietnamese food. And the same with the unit on films. He changed it to Vietnamese films, which the students knew. So just simple things to localize the materials can help. So you can't just take a course book for another culture and impose it on a different culture. Adaptation needs to be made. Okay, and the third point is, this is very important, I think, that it's very important that the first language of the learners continues to be valued and the cultures that they represent continue to be valued. There's a danger in EMI. This has happened in Nigeria. So for a long time, since I was there in 1966, English has been used as the medium of instruction. Therefore, it has become associated with what is valuable and worthwhile. And native vernacular languages have been devalued. There are now some Nigerian teenagers who cannot speak their mother tongue because in their home, their parents insist on only English. So imagine this, that the child is born in eastern Nigeria where Igbo is the language, and at 20 years old, he can't speak Igbo. He can only speak English. And that's a big danger with EMI. You've got to continue to value the L1. Okay, let me move on now, because I want to look. Oh yeah, there's just some references there on EMI and CLIL, which might be worth following up. I've got a list of references at the end. If anyone wants the PowerPoint, I'm happy for it to be given out and make use of the references. Okay. Right, so my principles of content teaching. I've mentioned most of these so far. The materials have to be connected to the lives and interests of the learners. This is vital. Even though the subject is astronomy, which is about the universe, the materials need to connect to the learners' lives. This is a rather complicated sentence. It should provide comprehensible, rich, recycled, and meaningful exposure to the language in use. Comprehensible, it doesn't mean you have to understand everything. The students can understand enough for it to be interesting, valuable, informative. Rich, the language isn't just simplified and reduced, it's natural. Recycled, it occurs many times. Meaningful, it is significant to the learner. It says something valuable to the learner. Okay? And as I said earlier, focus on the content whilst providing responsive language teaching. And the next one. Aim to stimulate effective engagement. I've talked about this. Aim to stimulate cognitive engagement. I've talked about this. And provide opportunities for both content and language discovery. Get learners to discover things for themselves. Don't just spoon feed. Right, so give problem-solving activities, projects, presentations, language discovery activities. I found this much more useful than teaching. Get learners to discover. Okay? All right, so we move on. I'll now move on to my actual methodology. Oh yeah, sorry, for elaboration of these principles, if you see these two books, Thomas and Massara, 2018, 2021, we go into great detail about all these principles. Okay, right, so what do we actually do in the classroom is the important question. I'm just going to mention 2 or 3 approaches I've found extremely useful for L2 content teaching. The first is TPR plus. Now, TPR is a method where the teacher gives instructions to the learners and they follow physically. And it means a total physical response. The learners don't speak. They don't use the new language. They follow physically. So the teacher might say, everybody stand up, put your hands on your head, turn to the window, right? And every lesson goes on like this. Now, we use this in Indonesia with beginners, but it gets a little bit tedious after a while. So we developed TPR Plus, in which the teacher, for example, tells a story and the students mime a story. I'll give you a quick example of one we did. The teacher says, right, I'm going to take you, no lesson today, no grammar today. We're going to the beach. You're sitting on the bus. Let's go to the beach. And then the teacher tells a story. A lot of people were on the beach. It was a lovely sunny day. Some of the people were playing badminton. And the students play badminton. And they mime it. Some of them were playing football. They play football. Some of them were reading books. Right? Suddenly, there was a strange noise from the sea, a strange humming noise. And it got louder and louder. And then it stopped. And 4 strange creatures appeared from the sea. These are 4 students who are confident students who I've told to stay at the back of the room. And when I say the 4 strange creatures appeared, they stand up and hold hands, holding hands in a circle. They're standing on a strange circular ship. The people on the beach were very frightened, so everybody's frightened. This is the emotive engagement. And then the story continues where the creatures step into the sea, they come to the beach, they look at somebody, they tell him, come and join us. He tries to run away, they shout, stop. And then he turns around and joins them. They take the prisoner in the center. They take 2 prisoners, and then they go back to the ship, and a strange humming noise starts again. It gets louder and louder. Then the ship disappears. The people on the beach carry on enjoying themselves. And that's part 1 of the story. The students have listened and followed and acted physically. That's the TPR. The plus is the story. Okay. What happens next is that the students retell the first part. The teacher will say to the students, a lot of people were on and they shout out, the beach. It was a very, and they shout out, sunny day. So the teacher shouts out the beginning of a sentence and the students repeat it. The students complete it. But then they get into a group and they write, they compose orally. They came from the sea part 2 in a circle story where they just go round and round making up the story. So this is TPR plus. It could be some days they brought ingredients and we cooked food. Some days they drew diagrams. They actually painted murals on the school walls. That was secondary school students. In Mali, agricultural students, I got them to mime. I read out the procedure for a particular crop, which they were studying, all the way from sowing the seeds to collecting the crop and selling it in the shops. And they went through the whole procedure in mime. And afterwards, they then read the procedure. So it's a way of introducing content and introducing language. And there is a reference there, Tomlinson 94. Okay, if you go on to my next one, this is my favorite approach, which I have called, a text-driven approach. in the text-driven approach, you don't start the lesson with a teaching point. So you don't say, today we will learn about gravity, or today we will learn about the past perfect. You start with a potentially engaging text, and the text drives the activities. Because we haven't got very much time left, what I'm going to do is give you an example of this from a science lesson for it's written for primary students, but I use these children's stories with adults. And in Oman, I use children's stories with EMI students at a high level. And they loved it because student stories are very silly. They always have a moral. And there's a lot of recycling of language. I'll end with a quick example of this. Right. What I'm going to do is read a fairy story. Now, fairy stories are fairly universal. So what I would start with, the activity in groups. Oh, sorry, the activity, first of all, think of a fairy story that you know. Then in groups, you tell each other about your fairy story. Do you agree? Is that what happened? And they argue about, because there are different versions of fairy stories. Or it could be local myths. In Vanuatu, in the South Pacific, we use local myths. Anything where there is something magical happening, as happens in fairy stories. Right? And then I say to them, I'm going to read you a story. Do you know the story of Little Red Riding Hood? Most people in Mexico, would people know Little Red Riding Hood? Probably. Yeah. Okay. Right. Now, I'm going to read you the story of Little Red Riding Hood, written by the wolf. So this is a story written by the wolf about Little Red Riding Hood. Little Red Riding Hood is going to visit her sick... Oh, sorry. As you listen, don't worry about any strange words you don't know. There's no test. Just try and see pictures. There are pictures here. Try and see in your mind the pictures. Little Red Riding Hood is going to visit her sick granny. Her mum tells her not to speak to any strangers on the way. Don't speak to strangers, she said to Little Red Riding Hood. As she skips through the woods, Little Red Riding Hood comes across the big bad wolf, a stranger, and has a big old chat. She tells the wolf where she's going. Big mistake. Now, he could just gobble her up, but that would be a rubbish story. So he concocts a complicated plan instead. Little Red Riding Hood finally arrives at her granny's house and knocks on the door. A growly, wolfy voice answers. The wolf is quite clearly in Granny's bed, drinking Granny's tea, wearing Granny's nightie. But Little Red Riding Hood doesn't even notice that it's a wolf. What big ears you have, Granny. This is very rude unless you're talking to an elephant. All the better to hear you with, my dear. Oh, what big eyes you have, Granny. All the better to see you with, my dear. Oh, what big teeth you have. All the better to eat you with. The big bad wolf pounces at Little Red Riding Hood, but luckily she escapes. She finds a woodcutter and asks him to help her. He comes along, grabs the wolf, and cuts open his tummy. And out springs Granny. The wolf swallowed her whole, so she's absolutely fine, just covered in wolf spit. The big bad wolf hobbles off to stitch his tummy up, whilst Little Red Riding Hood and Granny have a lovely wet hug. But this is so unfair and completely inaccurate. There's no way I could swallow Granny whole. Trust me. Now, let me teach you something. Would a wolf even want to eat Little Red Riding Hood and Granny? Wolves are carnivorous. which means we eat meat. But we're also afraid of humans. We usually run away from them. Wolves mainly eat large hoofed animals such as deer, mountain goats, and moose. Yum, yum. So Little Red Riding Hood and Granny would have been safe unless they decided to have a dress up as a moose party. Now, come on, could the big bad wolf swallow Granny in one big gulp? No, don't be silly. Us wolves tear our food into chunks with sharp teeth, and we have strong jaws for crushing bones. Some animals do swallow things whole, like frogs, owls, pelicans, wobbegong sharks, and turtles. Black swallower-fish can swallow animals up to 10 times their own size, which would be like a human swallowing a hippo in one gulp. Now, not many creatures could swallow anything as big as a person, except, and then the wolf pauses and says to the students, what do you think? What animal could swallow a person whole? And the students get together and talk about it, and they can use their phones if they like. They can consult websites, Wikipedia. Not many creatures could swallow anything as big as a person, except reticulated pythons. Pythons are one of the biggest kinds of snake in the world and can grow to about 7 meters long. A giant flying dinosaur called Hatzegopopotix had a huge jaw and fed on dinosaurs the size of small horses. So that could have swallowed Granny whole, but fortunately for her, it's extinct. Now, are big ears really all the better to hear you with? Unfortunately not. Most animals with big ears have them to help cool themselves down. Now, can you think of any animal which has very big ears? And the same thing happens again. They have to come up with an answer. African elephants have bigger ears than Asian elephants because they live in hotter places and they use their big ears to cool themselves down. Are big eyes really all the better to see you with? Actually, yes. Particularly if you're talking about seeing better in the dark. The colossal squid, which lives deep in the ocean where it's very dark, has the biggest eyes in the world. Its eyeballs are bigger than footballs. Right, now we know what really scientifically happened. I never ate Granny or knocked down those little pigs' houses. It's all lies. As for everyone else, here's what they did in their happily ever afters. And it goes on now, because in the book there are five fairy stories, all of them untrue, scientifically. So it's a nice way of combining narrative and science. And initially starting with the narrative to get the engagement, to get the affective engagement, then moving on to the science to get the cognitive engagement and getting the learners to discover the answers for themselves. So that's an example of the text-driven approach. Running out of time, so I don't really have time to go much more into that. But again, if anyone wants the PowerPoint, they can do, and there's a detailed example there. And if you just go on further, if you go on to the next one, So it's quite a long example, detailed example. And again, the reference is to Tomlinson and Tomlinson 23, 2023. I've got a whole chapter on the text-driven approach. The third one is the task-based approach, which I'm sure you all know about, where students are given a non-linguistic task to perform in groups. Right, so I'm coming, I think, towards an end where you can ask me some questions. If you just go forward a little bit, I'll come to the conclusion. So this is the task-based approach, which I'm sure you know a lot about. There again, there's a detailed example. And if you go on, there's also a task-based text-driven approach, which is very similar, but instead of writing a text, the students perform a task. Okay, that one again is a detailed example. And again, there's a reference. Okay. This is just say 1 minute about this. This is an example. It's for medical students, and it's a doctor who is worried about doctors interrupting patients, not giving them enough time to tell their story. And what happens is you get the students to be in threes. One's a student, one's a doctor, one's a patient, and one's an observer. And you ask them to act out a little scenario in which the patient goes to the doctor. And the observer has to time how long it takes before the doctor interrupts the patient. And then afterwards we check. And in most cases, it took male students 20 seconds before they interrupted, and females 1 minute before they interrupted. In the real experiment, which this guy, Dr. Barr, did, male doctors took one minute and 10 seconds before they interrupted. Female doctors took 3 minutes, but they all interrupted. Nobody let the patient talk. Now, what he did then was an experiment. The next time he was in his surgery, an old lady came in and he just let her talk. And she talked about her sister and the weather and problems at home. She kept mentioning cough, and she talked for 22 minutes. And the nurse kept coming in, pointing to the watch. Doctor, we got patients. But he let her talk and talk until she finished. And then he realized she'd talked so often about the cough, there was a problem. He sent her for an X-ray. And the X-ray confirmed his diagnosis that in fact she had cancer. She had lung cancer. And he said to her, "Oh, it's been a terrible day for you, hasn't it?" And she said, No. Don't worry about me. I've had a long life. And you're the only doctor who's ever listened to me. And it was very moving. This is a true story. And then there's a task for the students, which is to find a solution to this problem. How can doctors give patients more time to talk about their problem without interrupting when you've got a big queue of patients? So it's quite a demanding problem. So that's the cognitive. The story of the old lady is the affective engagement. The problem to solve is the cognitive engagement. So you see all these examples have this one thing in common: to try and get affective engagement. And the teacher telling this story doesn't use any of the medical terminology, but the actual article about it does. It's full of medical terminology. The students read that after they've heard the story. So after they've been affectively engaged, they then read the rather difficult text with medical terminology, and then they have the problem to solve, which is their cognitive engagement. And then they might focus on a particular language structure which has caused them problems, which could be the modals could or can. Well, the doctor could do this, the nurse could do that. So you started with the content. Your objective is to engage. Eventually, you feed back something on the language problem, which the teacher has noticed. Okay, so I will stop there and now conclude. If you just go on very, very quickly. Okay, if you just go on to the end. Could you continue the slide? Yeah. Okay, so just keep going. Keep going. The problem-solving projects. Yeah, great. Keep going. This is an example of a problem solving. Same idea. Okay, keep going. Almost there. Next page, I think. All right, and I guess another example there. You keep going. I wish I could talk about that. There's not enough time. Okay, and finally, we get to the conclusion, which is this. The important points I want to make are, with content, L2 content teaching, students should gain the knowledge and skills of their content subjects, whilst at the same time developing their communicative ability, not knowledge about the language, communicative ability. And the next point is, they should be stimulated by the delivery of the courses. And finally, most important point is, they should enjoy the courses they are studying. Learning should be enjoyable, both content learning and language learning. Okay, so at that point, I'll stop, and we just have a few minutes left for some questions, I think.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Tomlinson. I was not gonna lie, that final story that you just told about the doctor, I was taken aback. It was impressive, and you definitely caught. We were involved. Effectively, we were involved, I believe. I'm speaking at least on my behalf. We appreciate your presentation, and we do have time for a Q&A session. I request in the most attentive way, please, for everybody here in the audience, that if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. There's a raise hand button at the bottom of the platform. If you would prefer writing it in the chat, I can definitely read it to Professor Tomlinson and we can discuss. So any questions or comments, experiences that if anybody, well, Ermelinda Gonzalez said, very enlightening. Thank you, Professor Tomlinson.
Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else? Other questions? Okay. Well, I'm while other people think about their questions, I have one for you, Professor Tomlinson. Right. You mentioned something, well, not something, you mentioned, or you have been using this word, right? Like your effective engagement with the content is important. And EMI, it's rarely used to teach skills or special interests. Usually when we talk about EMI, we think about a school, a university, and we think about subjects like math and science. We don't really think about pottery or soccer or things like that. Do you think that these students who are, in projects or clubs, and they're learning about their special interests through another language, do you think that they develop language skills in a faster or more proficient way than students who are taking academic subjects?
I think so, yeah, because one of the points is they have chosen that particular topic or that skill. You've got to give a menu of choices. And if the learner has chosen to focus on fashion or football or pottery, then it's because they're really interested. They want to do it. So they're keen to learn the skill. In order to learn the skill, they need to learn the language. So they're highly motivated to learn the language. Whereas if they're just doing a biology course and they haven't chosen to do it, it's just on the curriculum, then the teacher has a big problem motivating them. But there's no problem in motivating students who have chosen to learn a particular skill through English. This is done in addition, of course, to academic courses. Although I have done sometimes, I've spent the whole term. I remember one term, we spent the whole term preparing to perform a play. They read the play, we discussed it, we analysed it, we rehearsed it, and then they performed it at the end of the term. A lot of language interaction and language learning. So the thing is there that they need the learning. You are creating opportunities for learning. You are creating needs. As I said, learners learn what they need and want to learn, not what the teacher decides to teach. Yeah, so that's, unfortunately, I haven't seen any conclusive empirical evidence of this, but that's been my experience.
I have a piggyback question off of that one.
Yeah.
Here in Mexico, or at least the context well, not me. It's been a really long time since I don't go to elementary school, but I've seen my little cousins and neighborhood
Yeah.
kids or whatever. And I think it's very popular right now, parents putting children in bilingual. I don't know if you can see, but I'm using air quotes. Bilingual schools, right? So they'll have from, I don't know, 8 a.m. to 12 p.m., they'll have
Right.
English, math, and I don't know, science. And they'll have those classes in Spanish. And then they'll go to recess, they'll come back, and then they'll have the same class, but in English.
Oh,
Do you
right.
think that's more effective than just simply them learning something new? I mean, that repetition for me, in my mind, I'm an adult and I would feel like that's a little bit tiring, like learning the same thing just in a different language. Or do you think it helps? Should it be something completely different or new, or regardless of interests? I mean,
I think that works if it's not exactly the same, but it is similar, if there are similarities. Very quick example of this. In Zambia, one of my students on teaching practice got her learners to make model aeroplanes out of paper. And the test was they had to fly their planes. And what she'd done was deliberately make the instructions difficult, complicated. They weren't good instructions. So the students made a lot of mistakes and they didn't fly very well. And she said to them, why did you have a problem? Oh, my English is not very good. And they blame themselves. And she says, no. You should have asked me if you didn't understand. And then she taught them how to ask for clarification. And then in the next lesson, they didn't make paper aeroplanes, but they made paper boats. And they took them to the stream near the school and sailed the paper boats. And then the students did ask the teacher, excuse me, I don't understand. What do you mean by? So the repetition of something similar, I think, is valuable. But the same thing, I think, as you, that it could get very, very boring. Another possibility is to start in English and involve the learners in English and then continue to a higher level in the L1.
I'm going to have to go around the elementary schools and make that suggestion to do it the other way around.
And one of the things I had to miss out is translanguaging, where you use both languages in the same lesson. And you might start, for example, completely in Spanish. I've seen this with a book. You start reading the book, first page is completely in Spanish. The next page is mainly in Spanish, but there are a few English words. And there are illustrations. And gradually, as it goes through, you get more and more English until the final page is written all in English. So it's moving from one language to another. It's another way of doing it.
Oh, okay. That's very insightful. Any questions or suggestions? Everybody's thanking you in the chat. So if there are no further questions, okay, I think there aren't. Well, we're done with this session. Once again, we thank Dr. Tomlinson for the interesting presentation, the input, the wisdom, the suggestions, and another way of looking at things as well. And we would also like to virtually recognize you, Professor, with this. Okay, it's online, for your outstanding participation. Thank you all for your timely attendance. I will read very briefly the virtual diploma. La Universidad Autónoma del Estado de Hidalgo, en conjunto con el Centro de Lenguas, a través del Congreso Internacional de Lenguas, otorga la presente constancia a Brian Tomlinson por su destacada participación en las cuartas jornadas académicas STIL, la lengua como medio de instrucción, con la ponencia Learning Content Through a Second Language, Theory and Practice, Vida de la Reforma Hidalgo a 5 de octubre del 2024, Amor, Orden y Progreso. Thank you so much. And I would like to remind everybody that you can check out the complete program of activities. I think that we still have 1 or 2 sessions available on the website for the conference. Join us for the last, I think it's 1 or 2 activities that we still have right now at 2 o'clock. And we also invite you to follow us through our social media accounts on YouTube, Facebook, X, and LinkedIn. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Tomlinson.
Can I mention one final point very quickly?
Yes, of course.
In your introduction, you mentioned MATSTA, Materials Development Association. We have a conference every year. This year, the conference is in Korea. Next year, the conference is in Mexico at your university. We are coming to you in June 2026. Yeah, 26. I will be there, so I hope to meet you all there and continue our conversation.
That's excellent. Thank you so much.
Watch out for notices about this. Okay.
Thank you. We will.
Look forward to meeting you personally.
You too.
Thanks very much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.